Undeniably, the notion of witches has been tied to the celebration of Halloween since the very beginning. In fact, Halloween itself has its roots in the ancient Gaelic celebration of Samhain, a pagan holiday that marked the beginning of the darker half of the year. It was believed, by some, that this was a powerful date on a witch's calendar, and a time when covens and creatures of the night would gather to commune with the devil himself. In other words, a pretty basic Friday night out with your friends. However, the conceived notion of witches as the brides of darkness and the actual reality of the practice of the craft tend to be wildly divergent. And a lot, if not all, of the negative feelings toward witches come from a mixture of old world superstition and just blatant misogyny. Greetings and welcome to the History of Fright. I'm your host, Michael Verratti. Today, we're going to have a small peek at witches of fact and witches of frightening fiction and how pop culture shaped them both. Witches have been depicted in art and stories as far back as medieval times and the Renaissance. However, in earlier representations, witches were not quite the fantastical beings that we know from pop culture today, but rather symbolic of a palpable fear of the unknown, as well as a scare tactic mechanism to keep people within the governance of the church. Many of these particular depictions of women who gave themselves to witchcraft preyed upon notions of propriety and what was considered appropriate behavior for ladies under a patriarchal society. In a culture that had very strong opinions of what women could do with their own bodies and sexuality, witches were often portrayed in art and paintings as frolicking nude in communion with the devil, the implication being that they were sexually giving themselves to the earth rather than heaven, a carnal pact with Satan himself. Basically, a whole society was so pressed by the idea of women having agency over themselves, they assumed they must be possessed by darkness rather than treat them like people. I wish I could say cultural attitudes have gotten better since then, but just remember to vote in November, okay? As scholars of history know, this fear and condemnation of women as witches led to some particularly violent moments in human history, including the famed Salem witch trials that occurred between 1692 and 1693. The puritanical punishment of individuals of being witches was so egregious that the city of Salem held a ceremony exonerating many of the victims of the witch trials in 2001. These days, the religious zealotry that led to the execution of so many women is recognized as the true evil, and not the witchery of which they were accused. However, even so, the mythos of witches as powerful, otherworldly beings continues to engage our senses and has permeated pop culture in an undeniable way. As any horror fan will tell you, witches are a staple of the fright film experience. Movies like The Craft, Practical Magic, Teen Witch, and TV shows like Charmed and The Witches of East End are just several examples of our cultural obsession with spellcasters. More so, modern witch iconography is inseparable from the Halloween experience, with images of broomsticks and black cloaks as common as jack-o'-lanterns and candy corn. And honestly, you have movies to thank for that, too. Much of the aesthetic we associate with witches today has less to do with those frolicking naked ladies of Renaissance time, and everything to do with one particular icon whose legacy is positively wicked. In 1939, when Margaret Hamilton stepped onto the set of The Wizard of Oz, she couldn't have possibly known that her green skin and pointy black hat would define the perception of generations to come about the standard appearance of witches. Though certain aesthetic elements of Hamilton's Wicked Witch of the West predate her performance in the film, the character's impact was so instant on the zeitgeist that how we perceive witches in pop culture was forever changed. Cinematic and cultural scholars alike agree that The Wicked Witch of the West forever altered the standard for what witches could be in the public consciousness. And really, you need only look around at decorations this Halloween season to see that fact on display. Every pointy hat and broomstick in flight owes a small debt to Oz's greatest villain. In fact, because of his affinity for high-flying broomstick shenanigans, even Harry Potter could be considered a distant descendant of the Wicked Witch. So, while presented as an evil character, the public's fascination with the Wicked Witch and subsequent integration of her imagery into its very cultural fabric feels like a win, especially when you consider the fact that witches were condemned not too long before her arrival on the scene. These days, witches, good, wicked, and in between, are as prevalent in our culture and stories as ever. From Willow and Buffy the Vampire Slayer to the arrival of the newly dark Sabrina the Teenage Witch, we haven't lost our fascination with those who dabble in the ways of magic. And, as for the real witches of the world, their practices tend to be centered around nature and the energy of the earth, and not, as the men of yesteryear wanted us to believe, around the devil. So, from the misogynistic condemnation of women just trying to live their lives, to the iconic contributions of one wickedly delicious resident of Oz, witches have always fascinated and engaged us, for better or worse. More so, some of the very imagery and traditions of Halloween wouldn't be the same without them. So, as you gather your coven to go trick-or-treating, take a moment and thank a witch. After all, autumn would be less magical without them. Until next time, thanks for watching History of Fright. For more horror content, visit our friends over at Dread Central. Follow my podcast, Dead for Filth, wherever podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow Gamma Ray across the web.